All right. Welcome, everybody. A big hello to folks joining us on Zoom, um, students, faculty, staff, community members alike. Another big hello to our audience in Tacoma right now. I'm so happy that we're able to share a virtual space today. Sorry, there's not more of a shared virtual environment, but I'm so glad that you all are all here. Welcome to our week 4 lecture in our Sustainability Business and Entrepreneurship lecture series. My name is Tamsin Foucrier. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a faculty member here at the Evergreen State College and the director for our Center for Entrepreneurial Leadership and Transformational Change. Today we are joined by Rachel Beth Egenhoefer, who I will introduce in just a moment. But before I do, I just want to give a little bit an overview. We are in the 3rd lecture of our series. So here we are today, and you can see that we have still 5 more lectures in the series for this quarter. And a reminder, these lectures are available and open to anyone in the community, anyone in the world. They're on Fridays from 1 to 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and the Zoom link is there below using the QR code. A quick intro for those who don't know our center. The Center for Entrepreneurial Leadership and Transformational Change, or the Celtic, is a public service center here at the Evergreen State College. We help support the development of sustainable and social business entrepreneurial leadership skills. We have one sort of foot internal to Evergreen and help with delivering curriculum development, certificates, courses, programs, events, but we also have work out in the community. We hold a lot of different roles at our center, and we're here for you. So if you ever have questions, please do not ever hesitate to reach out to myself or our assistant director, Paige Archer. You can email us at celtic@evergreen.edu. I will ask Paige to put the links for our website in the chat and our email addresses. This series is also co-sponsored by the Thurston Green Business, which is a certification for businesses in Thurston County around a green business. The applications for this next year will open around January, so keep an eye out for that. We are also funded in full this quarter by the Clean Energy Committee here at the Evergreen State College, or the CEC. The CEC is a student-led committee with the mission to support clean energy projects and share sustainability strategies at Evergreen. All right, without further ado, it is my great honor to introduce, welcome, and thank Rachel Beth Egenhoefer, who is from the University of San Francisco. Rachel Beth Egenhoefer is a design educator, sustainability and systems researcher, strategy consultant, and critical maker who uses design as a tool for social change. Her work focuses on shifting the narrative from sustainable to regenerative design that creates intersectional system change for the masses. She encourages regenerative actions to restore, rejuvenate, and re-energize ourselves, our communities, and our planet. Egenhoefer is a full professor in design and environmental studies at the University of San Francisco, as well as an affiliate faculty at the Presidio Graduate School. The second edition of her book, The Rutledge Handbook of Sustainable Design, was just published in April 2024, working to bridge academic speak, the design industry, and climate science to create lasting change for the everyday. She also writes regenerative conversations on Substack. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us, and I will hand it off to you.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm sorry, Rachel. I think I accidentally unmuted you. I meant to mute myself. My apologies.
No worries, no worries. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I was in person at Evergreen last spring as a visiting scholar with the Washington Center and met some of you all there then. And so I'm really excited to kind of be back here in a different capacity and sharing in a different way. So I'm excited for that. Let me just get, no, hang on. Sorry, I'm going to do, um, sorry, we're going to get it. We're going to get it in a minute here. All right, now you should be able to see a good part of my screen. We're good. We can see. Okay, great. Um, okay, so um, as Tamsin said, I am a design professor. I'm also a consultant. I kind of work at this intersection of design and sustainability and design thinking and systems thinking and how those two come together. And so today I'm going to give you just like an overview of kind of my approach to how I see design as being part of climate innovation and sustainable business and how we can think about things in maybe like a slightly different way. So the first thing is just to kind of talk about sustainable design methodologies. And I put sustainable design here in quotes because I don't actually believe that we're sustaining anything. Sustainable design is not sustainable, right? If we think about what the word sustain means, it means to kind of keep at a to sustain at a certain level, and we're not doing that. We're extracting more resources from the environment than we're putting back. So we're actually not sustaining anything. But it's this term that everyone kind of seems to understand or think they understand in this kind of light. This is a diagram here that was put together by Fabrizio Chechkin and Ezekiel Galadislas of kind of mapping some of the trajectory of sustainability and how we think about design for sustainability. I'm not sure how much of it you can see coming across on the Zoom screen here, but what I just like to point out is that when design researchers started thinking about sustainability, they were kind of in this space of thinking about like green design, eco design, cradle to cradle design, which a lot of it was really just thinking about products and making products more sustainable. And as time has gone on in the way designers have thought about sustainability, it's moved to beyond the product, to think about product systems, product service systems work together. What is service design? How do we think about more than just a product, but how a product interacts in time and space? So that's part of what this diagram maps here a little bit. It also maps this kind of change of how we've gone from thinking very insularly to systemically and thinking about kind of individual technologies to people, and how this kind of expanded notion of what sustainable design could be. So very often when I tell people that I teach about sustainable design, in particular when I first started in this field about 10, 15 years ago, I would tell people I work in sustainable design. And the first thing that they would think I did was make reusable tote bags. And that is not at all what I do, but there's kind of this like preconceived notion of like, this is what sustainability is, or like, this is what sustainable design is, right? It's like a reusable bag. That's what we think of. So it's not at all what I do, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought about how you can use the bag as a way to kind of unpack some of what sustainable design is. So sustainable design is visual messaging. If we look at the outside of the bag, it has a message on it, right? And here was kind of one of the early trends in sustainability or in sustainable bags and reusable bags, right? This like very designer trendy bag. I am not a plastic bag. So we think just about the visuals here, the aesthetics, that very much is part of sustainable design. We can also think about sustainable design as being materials. So here we see the bag being made out of recycled bottles. So instead of thinking about just the look of it, we're also thinking about what the materials are, right? Like what are the materials that this is made out of, that from the start, from the end of its whole life cycle, how are things working together? We can also think about the user experience. So the reusable bag is really great, but what happens if you forget to bring it with you, right? Then it's no good. So we think about redesigning the bag so that it can scrunch up into a little pocket and it can be clipped on our belt or thrown in our backpack or someplace else so that we don't forget it, right? So here we're actually looking at understanding behavior, habits, routine, cultural norms, expectations, and we're really unpacking like what's that user experience of using a bag. And that's part of sustainable design, of thinking about who is that user, how do they use products and interact with products. Sustainable design is also about psychology and rhetoric. So this is a somewhat now dated image of, kind of the time when IKEA first started charging for its bags. And the mindset that people went through from being charged a fee for a bag versus saving money for a bag, that simple psychology of reward versus punishment or save versus charge, changed the way some people brought their own bags in the beginning of kind of when we saw bag bans, right? So save 5 cents versus being charged 5 cents, save 10 cents versus being charged 10 cents. That simple psychology and rhetoric, that's part of what we think about when we think about sustainable design. How do we talk about things? How do we think about things, and how do we impact those different things? Sustainable design is also about policy, right? So here, I'm from California. I live in California right now. And we passed Proposition 67 a number of years ago that banned single-use plastic bags. So we can also think about sustainable design as policy and how you change policy and how policies can influence what you're allowed to put in products, not allowed to put in products, how you do things. So that's all really great and done, right? Like, hey, we passed this law, we changed things, like, great, good on us, pat ourselves on the back. Not really, right? So here is an example on the left. You see a single-use plastic bag that Target stores give its customers in states without plastic bag bans. And on the right, you see a reusable Target bag that Target stores in California and other stores that have bag bans in place, they sell you when you check out, because that's you can't give a bag away, but you can sell a customer a reusable bag. So it's made to be reusable. It's classified as reusable because it is made of thicker plastic, so therefore it can be used more times. But we haven't changed our behaviors. We don't actually use these bags as reusable bags. We're still using them as if it's a single-use plastic bag. So as a result, we're actually using more plastic now than before we introduced the bag ban. This isn't just true of California. This is true of many different states and different municipalities across the United States. And so now you're seeing like a new line of different, like, how do we change legislation now? How do we think about legislation? And it's interesting, right? Because you can't separate out people's behaviors. We can't just change the law, but not change our behaviors. They're all related. We have to change our behaviors. We have to change the way we think about things and interact with things, right? So sustainable design is also about rethinking the entire system. So what if I get rid of the bag completely and I'm no longer buying my food from a grocery store, but I'm buying my food from a CSA, where each week I'm getting that food delivered to me in a box and I'm reusing the box week by week, sending it back to the farm where I'm getting my food. And so in this example, I'm really taking into account the entire system. So it's not just about the bag or the box, but it's also about who's growing the food, where I'm getting it from, what are their values, what are their ethics, how do I relate to my community, how do I relate to the people who are producing and making this food, right? And that's really where the juicy stuff is, where we get to really making an impact, because we've now changed the system of how we've looked at what the purpose of this even is and how we're looking at it. So I come from a perspective where design is a holistic approach to creative problem solving. It goes far beyond medium specificity and looks at things holistically. So it's not just about the visuals. It's not just about making a pretty product, but really about taking a holistic approach to what design is. There's a quote here from David Orr, who wrote in Political Economy of Design in a Hotter Time. It is possible, in other words, that our individual competence, and perhaps intelligence too, is inversely proportional to the brain power that goes into our technologies and systems of all kinds of designs by teams of designers, each knowing a small part of the final example and perhaps nothing of the larger system of which it is part of or has the effects on the wider culture. As oceanographer Carl Safina puts it, as a species, we're pretty impressive, but as individuals, most of us, given bolts of cloth wrapped in a bow, couldn't sew a decent shirt. And I think about this a lot. And as a professor, I think about this a lot with my students because so often we think about ourselves as individuals and what do we design as an individual? What do we make as an individual? What do we do as an individual? But it's really about each of us working together on a small part of a system and working together holistically. Or has another example where he thinks about a pencil, a very simple pencil, right? If you think about it, it's like a very simple invention, right? But if we unpack it, it's got wood, lead, metal, rubber, plastic in the paint, right? All those materials all put together from like totally different places and totally different resources and coming together. So it takes like so many different resources, industries, people, factories just to make a little thing, right? If we think about everything in our world that way, it's pretty impressive to kind of unpack things in that way. So all design exists in a larger framework of a political economy by which costs and benefits are distributed within society and across generations. Whether we acknowledge them or not, the failure to design with physical and ecological realities incurs an irrevocable cost as well. So we think about these things aren't just complicated systems, right? But they also affect people. They also affect culture. They affect a lot of us in different ways. So when we look at systems, when we look at larger ways of how we design, systems thinking by Donella Meadows is kind of one of the key points, the key readings about how do you intervene in a system. Leverage points being these places where if you interject change at one point, you can make a change at impact. You can make a larger change in a larger way. So Donella Meadows introduced this, her 12 points, 12 ways to intervene in a system in the book, Thinking in Systems. And she has a lot of different ways of thinking about this too. And it was really foundational for me in understanding systems thinking and understanding how all the pieces fit together. And she kind of plots these 12 points on a scale, the 12 leverage points, with 12 being the easiest to do, but having the least amount of impact. And one on her scale being the hardest to do, but really having the most impact when we think about how we can make change in a system. So if we think about these leverage points and how we might create change in a greater system, we can use the plastic bag example to kind of walk through some of this, right? So if I'm changing the messaging, changing the materials, changing the physical pieces of how that bag is made, if I'm changing how I'm using the bag, whether it's, being here in this case, being made from recycled materials, or it's something that is clipped to me so I don't forget it, right? I'm changing the behavioral aspects of how I use the bag. I'm producing less and I'm using it in a different way, right? We can think about societal norms and that psychology and rhetoric piece and how we normalize certain behavior. We can think about policies being rules as part of the system, right? And then, of course, on the far end of her leverage point here is like, what are our goals? What are our mindsets? How do you change a paradigm? Right. And that, of course, is like really, really hard to do. And of course, like we live in this world of like, we want everything to be delivered to our door in 2 hours or less with a click of a button. And we're thinking about, okay, how do you really change culture? How do you change paradigms? Like, how do you change our goals? And that's really hard to do. And it's especially hard to do because we already have these underlying structures set up that don't necessarily support how we want to live. Right. So a lot of us live in this world where we want to have really good values. We want to have sustainable things. We want to support good jobs. We want to support things, but we're in this world where our structures are telling us just buy it on Amazon. It's cheaper and it'll be to your door in a minute. Right. So there's kind of this tension that we play with. In some of my work, I look at other kinds of behavior models of how do you get people to change their behavior? How do you use design to change behavior? Right. So this here is BJ Fogg's behavioral map of how he thinks about how we get people to do things. He has this idea that if something is hard to do and I don't have a lot of motivation to do it, I'm probably not going to succeed in changing my behavior. But if something is very easy to do and I have a lot of motivation to do it, then I'm probably going to succeed. I'm going to pass over into that action line to change my behavior, to change what I'm doing. So as we use design to think about how do you get people to do something differently? How do you get people to look at sustainability or business in a certain way? This is like a very kind of simple way of thinking about, okay, well, how do I make it really easy for people to do something? And how do I get them highly motivated to do it? Right? If something is too complicated, it has too many steps, it takes too long, I'm not going to want to do it. If I don't really care, I don't care about the environment, I don't care about like where something's going, right? I'm not going to have that high motivation to change. So kind of really looking at those different dynamics in that. The iceberg model for systems thinking is another way to kind of think about some of these really complex ideas of how do we get beyond just simple products, or how do we get beyond just reactionary ways of thinking. So this iceberg model, the example here uses the idea of catching a cold, right? So oftentimes like we get a cold and we're like, oh, like grab the Sudafed, get a cup of tea, like, whatever it is, drink the vitamin C and like get better. And we're just reacting to that. We're reacting to how do we get better in that situation. But if we look under the surface, if we look under the iceberg in this case, right, we can look at what are the patterns and trends. And it might be that, oh, I've been catching more colds lately because I've been sleeping less. That's the pattern and trend. If I can anticipate the pattern and trend, I can design for it in a different way. And if I change that pattern and trend, then maybe that'll affect the event differently. If I looked underneath a layer even more at these underlying structures that are under here, right? What are the things that have influenced those patterns, right? Well, maybe I have more stress at work and I'm not eating well and I can't access healthy food near work or home, right? I'm just grabbing like gas station Cheetos and like I'm not sleeping as well, and so that's what's causing my cold. Right. So if I'm looking at those underlying structures, I can design for those. And if I change the underlying structures in this particular example, right, what if I change how there was access to food, or how I might minimize stress at work, or how I can, kind of live a more healthy work-life balance? If I change the underlying structure, my patterns and trends can change. The event might change. Okay, well, how did we get these underlying structures? Well, we have to go even further in the iceberg to really look at the mental model. What are the assumptions? What are the beliefs? What are the values that people hold really core to them, right? Again, this is just a simple example, right? But sometimes we have this mindset that career is the most important piece of our identity, and healthy food is too expensive, and rest is for the unmotivated. Well, if that's my mental model, then of course I'm going to have more stress at work, and I'm not going to eat well, and I'm going to, not sleep and catch a cold that way, right? And again, as I pointed out, just a minute ago, like right now, we're kind of at this crux where people have beliefs and values that they really want to hold dearly, but it's just too easy for us to live in a way that is out of alignment with those values. So while I think that the climate crisis right now is the number one issue facing the planet, it's far from a singular issue. It's very pluralistic. It's very intersectional. So while it's very easy for us to kind of look at these points on a line in Donella Meadows' leverage point example in this very linear way, they're actually not linear at all. And they're very intersectional. They're pluralistic. They go in a lot of different directions, right? And this has to do with intersectionality, how things are different for different people, right? So as an individual, your race, your gender, your location, your ability, your sex, your class, all of those things impact how you experience the world as an individual. And of course, then mapped onto our social and our structural levels as well, this is how we see kind of underlying issues come out to play, right? It's how we see the effects of environmental racism when poor neighborhoods or people of color are disproportionately exposed to harmful chemicals, pollution, and gases, right? So sometimes I ask people, like, what are the living conditions of the people who support the comforts of your living? And I don't ask that to kind of place blame or guilt, right? But to kind of think about how do we think about this as a social justice issue, and how do we be proactive in addressing things as we move forward, right? So oftentimes we see people they'll kind of say like, oh, well, let's just all eat organic food. If we all eat organic food, we're going to solve the climate crisis, right? Well, there's a lot of questions, right? About like who can afford it? Who has access to it? Where is it sold? Where is it not sold? What kind of education do they have? How much does it cost? What's minimum wage? What should minimum wage even be, right? Who subsidizes growing food? Who markets the food? Who manages the food? Who profits from it? Who's harmed? Still really big questions, right, that have to go into our political systems, our education systems, urban design, race, economics, how we value our time, how, what, where we are, right? So it's really complex when we start to get at these bigger issues, right? So in that way, climate justice is racial justice, is gender justice, is healthcare justice, is education justice. All of these things are really interconnected and intertwined together, right? So when we think about this idea of design and innovation, how do we think more than just a product, than just a thing, than just a startup, right? But how do we look at kind of some of these underlying issues to really like kind of dissect and investigate, like what is the problem you're trying to solve, and how can you use design to unpack that a little bit, right? Um, so a lot of times we think of design, sustainable design, as being these kind of things, right? Shoes from recycled bottles, tote bags from tires, clothes from recycled fibers, like bags from sales. Like you've likely seen all of these ads. This is kind of what we're sold sustainable design to be, right? And in full disclosure, I own some of those products too, right? That's me wearing some of these shoes, right? So I'm full aware of it, right? But if we look at some of these products, right? And we begin by asking some of those same questions about food, about like what design really is, right? We can quickly realize that the majority of the people cannot afford these designer items, right? So buying these items will actually have a very minimal impact on the big picture based on who can afford them. And they're also kind of advertising this fake idea of what sustainability is, right? That sustainability has to be kind of the art of the eco, these eco brands, right? So in essence, in a way, these eco brands are greenwashing those who can't afford them into thinking that these small steps will save us and are reserved for those who can afford them. But buying the recycled sweaters and shoes and totes are really only going to have a minimal impact towards cooling the planet, right? So designer eco brands does not necessarily equal sustainability for all. I do think there are companies in this space who are doing some really great, amazing work. Patagonia is one to kind of highlight, of course, like in terms of how do you restructure a business? How do you do business in an entirely different way? And how do you think about that? So I do think there is
Sigma.
some space in this space that is changing things slightly. But by and large, I think they kind of advertise a different way of thinking about things. Transition design is another way of thinking about how do we use these leverage points? How do we use multiples to design towards something different? Transitioning entire societies to be more sustainable. Long-term futures is what Thomas Berry called the great work of the 21st century. This slide here is from Terry Irwin's work at transition design at Carnegie Mellon, who she really tries to get at systems level change over long horizons of time, right? So again, not necessarily designing for what can I get in that 2 hour delivery window, but really about like how do I change culture? How do I change how we're all living and working together and having that really deep understanding of complex systems? Irwin uses the example of acupuncture. If you think about how you acupuncture, if any of you have ever had acupuncture done, you might go to the acupuncturist and say like, oh, my neck hurts, or, my arm hurts. And sure, they might put a needle in your neck, but they're probably also going to put maybe a needle in your head, maybe some in your arms, your legs, right? Like maybe just like all around your body. Not just about that one spot, but it's about all of those needles around your body and the flow that's created between them to change the energy. And so this idea of intervention points, of systems intervention points, is a little bit like these acupuncture needles, right? That these points, these ecologies of intervention, when they all work together, will transition our culture. So it's not just about designing one thing. You can't just think about like, I'm going to design this like amazing new product and it's going to change the world, right? It's going to take all of us designing so many different things and designing them in different ways to transition us more towards a sustainable way of thinking. Another example here from transition design of thinking about kind of the different levels of niche being like, kind of these product levels, the stuff level, like the regime. What are our networks? What are our rules? What are our groups that kind of govern us, right? And then there's this landscape level, like what's in our social landscape? What's in our social fabric, our political, our cultural environment, right? And how we kind of think about how all of those things work together in different ways. So here, of course, there's a kind of simplified example of the moving from the horse and carriage to the car, right? And that didn't happen overnight, right? There was lots of different things that happened one at a time that kind of brought us to a different space. So if you think about horse and buggy to a car to now we have self-driving cars, right? There's so many different things that happened along the way that transitioned us to that different way of thinking and that different like way of being. So we need to think about our designs in the same way, right? Like, so it's not just about making a thing, but really about how do we make this system of things? And also, how do we move beyond sustainability? This kind of go back to what I started with in the beginning of sustainability in quotes, right? We're not sustaining our planet. So, how do we think about design in this expanded way? How can we design products, tools, systems, interactions, communities that can create more energy, right? The idea of regenerative design comes into play here. So, how do we make something that brings more energy, more interaction, that gives us more? So, if you think about composting, we take food scraps that we normally would just throw away and we put them in the compost bin, right? So our waste becomes food. That compost becomes this rich soil that is full of nutrients and helps us grow and give back to the environment. So something that was wasteful becomes more useful. It becomes food. It restores, right? It restores, it regenerates in that way. If we think about regenerative brakes in electric cars or hybrid cars, right? The act of pushing down on that brake generates more electricity. It recharges the battery, right? So, how do we think about all of the things that we do, right? Like as designers, as people, right? We need to move forward to thinking about how everything we do can regenerate ourselves, our collective, and our planet. So, again, it's not just about like a thing, a product, a startup, but how do these things all work together? When we work in the sustainability space, burnout is a huge thing, right? It takes a lot of work to kind of work on some of these big, wicked problems. And so this is why I really work in a lot of ways with this idea of how do you regenerate yourself? How do you take care of yourself? Because you can't take care of other people if you yourself are not taken care of. So how do you regenerate yourself so that you yourself can regenerate your collective? And so your collective can then regenerate larger entities, right? So, Project Drawdown is one example of an organization who is looking at where to make change at scale, where to make impact. The Drawdown studied many different solutions over many different sectors, and they've identified different areas that will help us draw down our carbon impacts, right? And if we look at this large scale of what would significantly have an impact on climate change, it's things like how we use cement, how we redesign refrigeration and cooling mechanisms, global education to get people out of poverty and reduce food waste, and other things of that nature, right? But last I checked, there's not a lot of designers who are currently working to make cement sexy, right? Or trying to market alternative cooling. But there should be, right? These are the things that are actually going to have impact in our world, but they're not the things that were necessarily sold as being sustainable, as being part of this world, right? So Drawdown has amazing resources about how we pull things out of the environment, how we put things back into the environment, how we work in the atmosphere, and where we can really make an impact in different ways. How do we reduce what we're taking out? How do we support what we're putting back into the environment? And like, where can we make shifts? So I highly recommend checking that out if this kind of stuff interests you, of like, how do you make a difference? How do you really make an impact that's going to affect our environment? So our collectives need that same type of care when we think about building and regenerating communities. It's not just about stuff, right? But again, this idea about improving our collective spaces, investing in each other, and whether that's like public green spaces and local businesses or community organizations, schools, like your next door neighbor, right? Like that's where we need to start. It's working on those small scales. And how do we invest? How do we regenerate in those communities and then build out from there? So I leave you with this thought, right? Is how do we design not stuff, not things, right? But how do we design to change systems that will change behavior, that will change our systems to change behavior, and kind of cycling over and over in that way. That's me. If you want to take a quick screenshot, I can share all my info in the chat as well, or I'm sure it's on other stuff from Evergreen. But yeah, that's what I have for presentation today. And I would love to take any questions or comments or anything that anyone has.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm going to invite folks to either raise their hands if you want to speak your question in the Zoom space, or put them in the chat. I can read out the questions as they come along as well. I will also be submitting some questions in the chat, Rachel. They're not from me, they're actually from my students who submitted some questions beforehand. And so I'll speak those out, as we have gaps or some quiet, and I'll also put them in the chat for people to read. So I'm going
Okay.
to ask for any questions that folks want to pose.
I see there's a comment in the chat about the reusable plastic and nylon bags are not recyclable or biodegradable. Very true. The thin plastic, hard to recycle. There are some people who do it. Do they do it at scale? No. The biodegradable thing is also a misnomer because a lot of our industrial biodegradable bags or biodegradable products, right? They only biodegrade if they're actually in an industrial composter. Um, I believe up in Washington, like a lot of you guys have curbside compost and curbside recycling, that your curbside compost pickup that will take it to an industrial composter. But most of the United States doesn't yet have that capability. So if you're just throwing it in the trash, it's going in the landfill and it's not going to biodegrade. So yeah, good points of like, sometimes we think these things are working, but again, it's that systems view of like really being able to support the systems. Um, is my video on YouTube? It's not the organic food one. That's my own, but it will be in this recording when this is done. Yeah, that's really different for everyone. And I would just say to kind of think about like what really regenerates you. Um, Sometimes we get this idea in our head that like, oh, I'm gonna like Netflix and binge and it's gonna like make me feel better, but you actually don't feel better afterwards. Like you feel more tired afterwards, right? Not for everyone, not in every situation, right? But there are times when that happens, right? Um, but so really thinking about like what are activities that restore your energy, your personal energy, right? And that's different for everyone, right? Some people it's walking or running or gardening, swimming, painting, talking with friends, right? Um, that's something that you kind of have to think about for yourself and be able to give yourself that energy. Another way to think about regenerative principles is to think about the idea of mutuality and extraction, right? So if we think about all the things we're extracting from the resource, from the earth, from all of our resources, we are a very extractive economy. We don't necessarily give back. So how can you live in a way where you have mutuality in your relationship? So depending on what you extract from other people, from the environment, from different situations, what do you also give back? And thinking about your own self, right? Is like when are other people extracting energy from you? And what are you getting back from that? Right. And sometimes just by the nature of our environment and by the nature of our society, it's, money. You're exchanging money for services, money for goods, right? But also kind of getting beyond that of just thinking about what do you uh how do we live more in mutuality with one another than in an extractive economy? Yeah, I hear you. um I would there's two parts to my answers. One is I'm always asking people like what's the problem you're trying to solve? I find that a lot of times with students, particularly like business students, entrepreneurship, you're looking for like a thing to make, right? Which is like I'm not faulting any of you, right? It's like in your blood, right? But it's like you want to make this thing, right? And then you have to kind of take a step back and say like, well, what problem is that trying to solve, and is that the right problem, right? And so really starting from like, what is the problem? Is that the right problem? Is that the way to solve the problem? With a lot of my practice, I use a design thinking approach. So before you even start with this is what I want to make or this is the thing I'm going to do, right? You're really looking at that problem space and observing behavior, doing ethnography where you're trying to understand how do people do things, why do people do things, right? And that's where you then can like find like, oh, well, maybe if I change this other thing, it's going to actually make a bigger difference, right? Um, and a lot of times it's getting away from like a product, but maybe situating a product within a service, or how do you like support underlying things, right? Um, I think there's some good examples when you kind of think about a lot of times in our tech world, right? We always want to go like, oh, like let's just make an app. Let's make an app, right? But in certain communities, like apps don't work, right? I think there's been a lot of interesting examples coming out of like farming communities where people are like, oh, let's make an app. But then you interview a bunch of farmers and they're like, we don't want an app. That's too much for us. It's more work for us, right? So by going to that ethnography piece and really figuring out what is the problem you're trying to solve, why do people do things, and getting at that is going to have more of an impact than just going in and saying like, I already know what the problem is, I already know what the solution is, like this is my way of how you're going to fix it. I think that kind of addresses some of that piece. The other element I would say is that it's really hard sometimes. Like you're like, oh, we got to change like the whole world, but you can't. Like you can only change kind of like what's in your community, right? So a lot of times I encourage students to think about what can you change in your community where you could actually measure impact, right? So maybe that's just like one thing in your neighborhood, or maybe you start a small organization on campus and see what you can do with that. And maybe it grows and it becomes something bigger. You know, maybe then it goes to the next campus over, the next town over, it becomes bigger, right? But if it's something that you can have control over in your community where you can see the impact and you can measure that impact, there's a way that you get a little bit more satisfied because you can see those tangible results there, right? There's a neighborhood organization that I'm part of where we meet once a week and we go around and we pick up trash in our neighborhood, right? And sometimes we run into people and they'll kind of like say these like snide things and they'll be like, oh, like why even bother? You know, like there's just always, you're never going to get all the trash. You're never going to pick it up, right? And there's this way where you're like, well, yeah, you're right. Like I live in an urban place and you're right, right? But there's also this way that it's not actually, yes, it's about picking up trash, but it's also about the fact that we're building community. We're getting to know our neighbors. We're like getting into like other issues around the city and like in part of the community. So when you look at the impact of it isn't just about trash, it's also about building community, right? And so how do you kind of see that in like different ways? Um, I hope that answers your question. That was kind of like a lot. It was a long way of answering it, but yeah, those are my two big things: design thinking to figure out what the actual problem is, and start small in your neighborhood where you can measure the impact. There's funny things like, right. So thinking about the rhetoric piece, there was a study where some people on my campus, they were studying, people go to the cafeteria and you can either get your food for here to go, right? Like if you get it for here, you get it on a plate, and if you get it to go, you get it in a container that you toss, right? And there was, we studied the behavior, like what happens in that split second when you're ordering your food and you make that decision. Do you want it for here to go? Right. And so by doing a lot of ethnography, by doing like a lot of just like observations, thinking about things, watching people interact, asking people questions, right? There is this way that we found out that when I ask you, do you want that for here to go? The last thing you hear me say is to go, right? So if I switch that, or if I don't give you an option, if I don't like even put that idea in your head, do I want it to go? Right. But just like, are you eating here? Um, the amount of to go containers cut down immensely. Right. Um, Now, of course, this is tricky because you have to retrain the workers to say things differently. And we all know, like, you know, habits are hard to change, right? And even just like here to go, like that's so ubiquitous, right? So it's a tricky thing to actually like change. If you're not just talking about changing the behaviors of like the users, it's also the workers, and it's a much bigger system. So it's a small example, right? But and that was something where it was like we never would have guessed that, right? Like, you know, here again, people are always looking for like, let me make this product, let me make this system, let me make this app where you're gonna like save points every time you like, you know, don't use a to go container. And it was like changing wording. I'm trying to be hopeful right now. um, it's a fair point, right? I would like to remain hopeful and optimistic. I also think that there's certain things that are being driven. There's so many different drivers, right? And there are cost drivers, right? There's a sustainability case that just has to do with cost, right? So even just, take everything else out, like cost is going to change things. So I think regardless of the election, there cost will always be a driver. I do think there is more and more of a growing concern for the environment and for what we're doing to the environment. So there is a way that, yes, even though government policy might be different, that industry is going to lead some of these things. There's also ways that states kind of lead things. There are certain states in the country that have greater influence than others. So if there's a state law in one state, it tends to carry over to other states just because of how things cross state lines. And I think there's also a growing amount of international pressure, right? If some of these brands want to do business internationally, they're going to have to make compliances to do that internationally. So even if we have the worst outcome possible, I will try to be hopeful that there's still going to be drivers based on cost, based on industry, and based on individual states as well as international. Um, yeah, I mean, like education is everywhere, right? So education is like at home, at school, like in preschool, in K-12, in higher ed, like it's everywhere. And I think like sustainability should not be separate from any other issue we're talking about, right? I really do see it as this intersectional topic that is, embedded in everything we do. So how do you change an education system where like everything that we're doing is also about sustainability, and not necessarily seeing it as this other or this extra thing, but really just embedding it as part of like this is what we need to do in order to survive, no matter what industry you're in, right? If our planet's not here, you're not going to survive, right? So how do we think about sustainability in sports, in politics, in in history, in innovation, in transit, like everywhere we need to be thinking about it. So its role in education is that it needs to be everywhere. um, and I think the other piece of that is that we really need to understand what sustainability actually means, right? That it's not necessarily just like using a reusable straw, right? Or using the reusable tote bag. Like, yes, that's good, but there's much bigger issues, these structural issues, these systemic issues that we need to get at and learn. And that's tough. Again, it's not something you can do very quickly. But that has to be part of it. Wow, that's a big question. Like I have so many, right? To go clean my office, to get dinner on the table. That's a goal, right? Name them all, right? Yeah. Um, uh, if I'm honest, like I myself struggle with the exact same things that I just preached to you all, right? And my own work-life balance, regenerating myself, in addition to being able to regenerate those around me, that's just it's like an ongoing goal. And I think that's the hard thing about sustainability is we often think like, oh, it's a goal, we're going to get there, we're going to check the box and we're going to be done, right? And that's not the case, right? It's an ongoing practice. It's never going to be done. We're not going to just like be done being sustainable, now we can move on, right? I think rather than think about it as like what's a current goal, it's just like that's a current like that's in it. That's how we are at, right? Um, what is a long-term goal or a bigger goal for my future? Everything I'm talking about with you guys today, like this is what I think about a lot. It's like how do we get people to understand these things, right? I think about Target stores, right? They have this big initiative that they want all their stores to be on the circular economy by 2030. And I think like that's great. But if I think about like the average person who shops at Target, do they have any clue what the circular economy is? And even if they do they have the like habits and the mindsets to like live that lifestyle? I doubt it, right? So how do you take all this like academic research that we have, all this scientific information that we have, and how do you bring that to people and bring it to them in a way that they're going to understand and they're going to act and they're going to change? I think that's something I always think about it. I don't have it in a neatly packaged goal, but that's my goal in the future. I guess to be more tangible too. I did write an academic textbook Um, and I always have said I would like to kind of take that same information and put it in a pretty book with lots of watercolor pictures and make it not nearly as expensive as academic textbooks are. And maybe that's part of like reaching that larger audience. A banana peel, um, that's a great food packaging, right? I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Sustainable consumer packaged good unless everything that's been extracted has been returned to compost. A product or a thing that does this, yeah, not other than a banana peel, no. Because again, like we're always extracting more than we're putting back. I think you know ways that try to get around reuse is maybe close to it, right? Like reusing glass bottles, reusing packaging in that way that gets close to it. Um, or simply like not packaging things, right? Like opting for the box instead of the bag. But um
Thank you. Yeah.
yeah.
I think I would also argue that even a banana, right, and the transportation of that banana and how it's grown, that we don't
True. Yes,
do
yes.
lots of
Unless you're picking it right from the tree and enjoying it there and putting it right into the compost. Yeah. Yeah. Um, I would say lead with a heart, lead with your heart and lead with hope, right? A lot of times people ask me, this looks really grim. Like, how can you do this? And I just think, well, what's the other choice? To give up, right? And I don't want to give up. So I would say lead with hope. I would say find your passion, find your place in this work that you're really passionate about and work there. Because if you don't have passion, you're just going to burn out. You're not going to care, right? So figure out what it is. Is it water? Is it food? Is it fashion? Is it packaging? Is it cooking? Right? What's your piece, right? And then match that with what your skills are. Right? Are you a podcaster? Are you a writer? Are you into policy? Like, what are you into? And how do you like kind of merge and mash up that your passion and what you love doing and what you're good at, and then start small, start in your community where you can change, and start where you can, and grow from there. So that would be my advice for people.
I love that. I think that's a perfect ending answer. I want to invite all of us in Tacoma on Zoom, just to say thanks. Could be, thank you in the chat,
Yay hearts, yay emojis.
sending energy through the Zoomosphere. Rachel, thank you so much for your time, your wisdom,
Thanks.
expertise today. I so appreciate it, and we all do.
Of course. Yes. Thank you for having me. And feel free, anyone, to reach out to me on email or LinkedIn or elsewhere. And yeah, thank you all.